In the last lecture video, we looked at the structural baseline of Genesis 1 through 3, understanding how we read the Bible and how that matters, and seeing that humanity was created for relationship and rule, but how rejection of God's word destroyed both of those things. And now we're going to step into what is maybe the most important verse theologically of the entire Old Testament, Genesis 3:15, which is often referred to as the Protoevangelium. That just means the first gospel. From the earliest time of the church fathers, this was seen as the first pronouncement of a promise of the Messiah. So when God pronounces judgment in the garden, he doesn't just issue a curse on the serpent. Inside that curse to the serpent, directly inside of that judgment, there is also a roadmap, a blueprint that sets up the rest of the book of Genesis, the Old Testament, and even the story of the whole Bible. So we're going to trace this seed promise that's given within that judgment, step by step, to see how a single sentence in Genesis 3 frames an entire cosmic war across generations that leads even up to today. So let's begin by looking directly at the text of Genesis 3:15 itself. God says to the serpent, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall strike your head, and you shall strike his heel." If you look closely at how this verse is constructed, it's not just a poetic statement. It's a three-part narrative framework that drives the entire plot of the Bible forward. First, there's conflict. I will put enmity between you and the woman. God initiates an active war between the woman and the deception of the serpent. Second, there's continuation between your seed and her seed. This conflict isn't going to end in the garden. It's going to extend across history and through generations and generations of descendants. And third, there's climax. He shall strike your head and you shall strike his heel. This struggle will ultimately end in a final decisive encounter between these two representatives, these two seeds, descendants, followers of the original lines. So let's unpack each of these three elements and see how they function in the story. First, let's look at the word conflict, and specifically at the word enmity. When we hear the word enmity in modern English, we might think of a minor grudge or some dislike between people. We maybe don't even use the word that often, but this is far too small. The Hebrew word used here refers to hostility, hatred, and like a kind of warlike antagonism between these two parties. Notice who initiates the conflict. God says, "I will put enmity." Well, why is that significant? Because prior to this, Eve had allied herself with the serpent against God's word. But by putting enmity between the woman and the serpent, God is breaking humanity's allegiance with evil. He's establishing an enduring battle line where this line is drawn and humanity is on one side, hopefully, and the serpent is on the other. But we're going to see it gets a little mixed up. But remember here, that enmity is not mere dislike. It's war that defines history of the world. From this moment on, human history becomes a spiritual battlefield. That brings us to the second phrase, continuation. God declares that hostility will extend between your seed and her seed. And that word, seed, zera in Hebrew, is really important in the text of Genesis, and it starts here. So what does the text mean by seed? In Hebrew, that word, zera, can refer to physical offspring or descendants. But as the biblical narrative develops, we see that seed also takes on a really spiritual dimension. On one side, you have the seed of the woman, originating with Eve, those who align with God's promise, trust his word, and walk in righteousness. But on the other side, you have the seed of the serpent. Now, we're not talking about serpents having snake eggs or having literal biological human offspring. So what's going on here? The seed of the serpent refers to those who embody the serpent's character, those who operate in rebellion, deceit, and rejection of God's authority. So the continuation of this promise means that history will be characterized by two distinct lines or lineages and allegiances living side by side, but living in war. So let's take a look at the diagram on this slide, because this represents the primary narrative force of Genesis 4 through 11, and really the entire Old Testament. You have two parallel trajectories running through history. First of all, the righteous line, those who call upon the name of the Lord, the lineage of Eve's seed carrying the promise and looking for the deliverer who will crush the serpent and restore creation. And then there's the evil line, the line that follows the serpent, the serpent seed that perpetuates violence, rebellion, and self-exaltation, lacks humility. As you read through the whole Old Testament, one of your primary literary jobs is to trace these lines, especially in these early chapters of Genesis. Every time a new character is introduced, the text is inviting you to ask, is this person walking as the seed of the woman, or have they become the seed of the serpent? And we're going to see pretty quickly that these battle lines get drawn and diverge. So let's see how this works out specifically in Genesis chapters 4 and 5. At the beginning of Genesis 4, Eve gives birth to Cain and says, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. You can imagine Adam and Eve asking, is this the seed? Is Cain the one who will come and conquer the serpent and get us back into the garden? They knew there would be a descendant, and Cain's a descendant, so maybe he's the one. But almost immediately, Cain lets sin crouch at his door. He murders his brother Abel. Cain doesn't act as the seed of the woman, he acts as the seed of the serpent. And if you trace Cain's genealogy down to Lamech, you see evil escalating. Lamech boasts about killing a young man and multiplies violence. That's the evil line. But then let's look at the top branch. God grants Eve another son, Seth, and in Seth's line, people begin to call upon the name of the Lord. By Genesis 5, we trace Seth to Enoch, who walks with God. That's the righteous line. And so on Cain's line, we have a culmination in like the seventh generation of Enoch, who is so much worse than Cain was. And then in the righteous line, we have a culmination in Enoch of someone who's calling upon the name of the Lord. Really looks like this is going to be the deliverer. But what happens? He's taken up and he is not the seed. So when we look at genealogies, we look at the genealogy in Genesis chapter 4, and that's really the continuation of that evil line, as we said, culminating in Lamech as the worst of the worst. And then when you get to Genesis 5, you have the righteous line. And you notice something, again, that is very important. If you're looking for repeated vocabulary, now I know that sometimes genealogies seem boring and we kind of tune out, but this one's really unusual because it includes a phrase that isn't usually there. Usually we say, this person lived and he had this many children and this is how long he lived. And then you move on to the next. But over and over, the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5 repeats some heavy words. It says, he had this many children and he lived this long and he died. And then we see that over and over and over again in Genesis chapter 5. And he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. So what is the text doing here? Why does it repeat that? Because even in the righteous line, death still reigns. They're faithful, but none of them is the ultimate seed. They're dying, pointing forward to a seed that's not yet arrived. It also calls us back to the actual curse, where when they ate the fruit of the tree, they didn't die right away. But now we are seeing, first of all, that in Genesis chapter 4, when death arrives, it's not natural death, it's murder. And when it's murder, it's not even just a man murdering someone else, but a brother murdering a brother. And now we get this emphasis over and over and over again that they keep dying, they keep dying, they keep dying. So that brings us to the third and final phase of Genesis 3:15, the climax represented by two strikes. God says, he shall strike your head and you shall strike his heel. Notice the asymmetric contrast between the two strikes. The serpent strikes the heel of the woman's seed. Now, a heel wound is painful, bloody, and debilitating, but it's not going to be fatal. Throughout the Bible, the righteous line and ultimately the Messiah himself endures real suffering, persecution, and death inflicted by evil people, by the line of the serpent. But on the other side, the seed of the woman strikes the head of the serpent. A head strike is fatal, and it's going to destroy that. So this permanently crushes and destroys the snake. So while Genesis 3:15 may not spell out every detail of Christian theology in just one verse, it does form the shape of redemptive history. It's the promise that begins everything, kicks everything off. So the serpent will inflict suffering on the righteous line, which culminates ultimately at the cross, where Jesus' heel is struck in a painful death. But in that very act of dying, Jesus delivers the ultimate fatal blow to the serpent, resurrecting from the dead and stripping evil of its ultimate power. So as you continue reading Genesis 6 through 11 this week, keep your eyes on the seed conflict. Look at how Noah and the ark and the Tower of Babel, all these things fit into this idea of these two lines battling.